Welcome to the One NFP Financials and Financials Lite training on funds. Nonprofit organizations have an added complexity for accounting in that, as you all know, you receive money from grantors and you need to be able to track that money and report on it separately just on that information, but also as the organization as a whole. So in One NFP Financials and Financials Lite, we use the fund for that. Every transaction you post will have to have a GL account. We also call this the natural account, so that might be office supplies, and a fund. Has to have a fund. So if we look in my sample company, I have several funds here. I have an operating fund, and that is unrestricted. I have a donations fund that's temporarily restricted, so maybe people have donated money for a specific use. And then I have some grants. I created this grant, the Walker Foundation Fund, specifically for this training. So let's take a look at it a little more closely. How you set up your funds will really depend on your organization and what grants or awards or endowments you have and how you want to track them. But I imagine you will have several funds. So I've created this fund. The fund card itself is fairly straightforward. You're going to have to enter a number. That number, by default, the number series for funds is set up to allow default numbering or manual numbering, so you can use your own value here for this field. Also required will be the fund class, and let's dig into this a little bit more deeply. Out of the box, you'll have these three. The fund class actually is a user-defined value. Let's look at this list. You can create your own, but they will all have to have one of these three restrictions: permanently, temporarily, or unrestricted. So for example, you may decide to have two temporarily restricted classes, both of them with the restriction value of temporarily restricted, but maybe one you've designated by time and one by function. That would be for you just to help with your reporting or your use of it to help guide you when you're looking at it, but it's always going to have to be able to identify exactly how it's restricted. In this case, it's my new fund is temporarily restricted. Fund type is completely user-defined, and that really is just for reporting. So you may have different ways you want to categorize and report on funds, and you can use the fund type to do that. The restricted by date, you don't have to use these. These are completely optional, but they are very useful if you have a fund that really is restricted by date. So in this case, Walker Foundation has given me $500,000, but I can only use it in 2015. If I go in on January 1, 2016, I will not be able to post. I could try and post, but I'll get an error message. This software will stop me. So let's look over here at some of the other information you can store with the record. And this can be very helpful. So in links, I've added a link to Walker Foundation's, my little fictional foundation's website. So you might have maybe an announcements page on grant information or something like that. You could add a link to get directly to that website. You can keep track of information using notes. So I've added a note here that I spoke with the contact and they want to come visit the site. I can add a new note by clicking that little plus sign and add some information, and it'll track who added the note, and you can keep track of all kinds of information about the fund there. You can do file attachments. I've added the award letter for this fund, so I have it here right on the fund. I don't have to keep it in a file cabinet in my office. It's stored electronically in the system. And then my extended fields. Let me scroll up a second and look at extended fields. I'm not going to try and train you on creating extended fields in this training. You can look in the online help and learn more about that. But what extended fields are user-defined fields to store additional information that isn't already on the fund card. So we have created in our sample company, we have a field where we store the contact name, and I can store the contact email. And using the effective date, I can add, let's say, Jenna, my contact, leaves. I can say on 7/15, the new contact is Steve, and I can store an email for Steve using that effective date. The report date, this is also useful. I can use the analysis in extended fields to see a review of all my funds and what the reporting date requirements are. So I can have a quick overview and see, okay, I need to create a report for Walker Foundation in June and for my state grant in July. So that's just one use for extended fields. Again, you can learn more about extended fields in the online help. So let's take a look over here. So I have budgeted for this fund. Let's take a look at those budget transactions. I'm going to exclude the reclassifications. I'm going to talk to you about reclassifications in just a second. Whoops. Actually, that filter would have worked better if I had said, rather than show me 4,500, show me not 4,500. There we go. So we can see how this budgeting works. Budgeting in the system is transactional. So I have budgeted by date, by the fund, and actually down to the cost center and program level. You do not need to get down to that level. You can see I did not budget at my employee dimension level. It's up to you how detailed you want to get in your budget or how high level. It really just depends on how you need to report on that information. So I have my account and my fund and all of my budgeted spending. Now let's take a look at my actuals. Again, we'll talk about reclassifications in a moment. Let me exclude that account. So we can see we got a $500,000 deposit because they went ahead and they gave us the whole money up front, and then I started spending it. And we can see that spending. Now let's take a look at some reporting and how you can leverage the fund and having this information in your reporting. So I've created a user-defined report, budget to actuals, specifically for this fund. Let me hide my parameters for a moment. We can see I've got by period how much I'm spending and what I've budgeted, my year to date, and my overall annual budget. How you budget is entirely up to you, whether you want to load in the entire budget for the year on January 1, or like I did in my example, I have budget spread out across each month. I've budgeted a certain amount for January and February. This report is because I did that. If I had uploaded all my budget in January, it wouldn't work quite this way. So let's take a look at my parameters for a second, and let's drill down a little deeper. Remember, you remember what the budget looked like, I budgeted down to my programs. So now I can see specifically for that one program, what was the budget, how am I spending against that. We can see I went a little bit over budget this last month or on the year to date. And you can put in controls that can allow that or can stop it, that would have stopped the transaction cold and not allow it to post. So let's close this, and there's one other report I'd like to look at. So let's look at the statement of activities. I'm going to look at it for this year, and I want to filter just on this fund. All right, now let's talk about reclassification. You saw the entries when I drilled into the ledger entries. The software has an automatic feature that you can activate if you choose that will release the funds, the temporarily restricted funds, release them from that restriction and make them unrestricted. And it all hinges on that fund class. So you can see I received the money and it was temporarily restricted. But then I was I had my automatic restriction, releasing that money as I spent it so that my expenses actually get flagged with a fund class of unrestricted. So I'm tracking what's been released from restriction, but when I look at my statement of activities, my expenses are all falling as unrestricted. So hopefully that helps you understand funds a little bit and a little bit more about some of the functionalities and features in the system. Thank you for listening and watching this video, and keep your eye out for more training.